In today's video, I'm going to be discussing how to crush when you miss the flop in No Limit Texas Hold'em. In this strategy segment for coinpoker.com, we're going to be discussing a common issue that I see many players struggle with. Some of you in the comment section down below struggle with this exact thing. They struggle with the fact that they do not know what they should do when they raise before the flop, somebody calls, and then they completely miss on the flop. They have nothing. They don't know if they should bet or if they should check. And I get why this is a difficult spot, because it's hard to know how to play when you have nothing. But today, I'm going to teach you how to crush when you fail to connect with the flop. And it's not as easy as just bet every time or check every time. It actually depends on a whole lot of factors. And we're going to go through all of these and then give you some examples to make sure you understand how you should play when you fail to connect with the flop. The factors that this depends on are your range and your opponent's range and how those interact together. Also, your position and your opponent's position matters a lot. Your stack depth matters a lot. As stacks get deeper or shallower, you should be using different strategies because you're closer and closer to being all in. Also, your opponent's general tendencies matter a ton. If your opponent will fold too often, or if they won't raise enough, you should bet way more often. If your opponent will not fold very often, or they'll raise a lot, you should be betting less often. And finally, the number of players in the pot will matter, because as more players are in the pot, someone is likely to have a very good hand. And if it's not you, it's probably somebody else. So, the first thing you want to ask yourself is, do you have the range advantage? Now, what is the range advantage? Essentially, you want to take your entire range that you get to the flop with, which is going to be your entire pre-flop raising range, and compare that to how your opponent's entire range fares on the flop, which will be whatever they call with before the flop. And if your range has something like 55% equity or more against your opponent's range, you should usually bet close to every single time or every single time, which implies even when you have nothing, you should keep betting. For example, say you raise from first position at a 9-handed table, and the big blind calls, and the flop comes ace, king, queen, and the big blind checks. Consider your under-the-gun raising range. Well, it's going to be a whole lot of big cards, all of which are pretty good on ace, king, queen, a bunch of suited aces, which are also very good, some pocket pairs like aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, those are good enough, but then some hands that are not particularly good, like pocket sevens, or maybe a hand like 6-5 suited. Even though 6-5 suited is really, really bad on ace, king, queen, because the rest of your range is so incredibly good on ace, king, queen, you get to bet with everything in this scenario. Also, if you consider how your opponent's big blind calling range is going to connect with this board, it's actually pretty bad, because they're going to be re-raising their best hands like aces, kings, queens, and ace, king, so they don't have those in their range anymore because they would have re-raised them. Remember, they just called pre-flop. And they're also going to have a whole lot of junk like 6-5 offsuit, 7-6 offsuit, 8-7 offsuit, etc., etc., etc. So this is a spot where your range absolutely crushes your opponent's range, so you should be betting every single time in this scenario, even when you miss. Alternatively, when you do not have a sizable range advantage, when the board's a little bit better for your opponent, you should check with your hands that have little to no chance to improve. For example, say you raise under the gun and the big blind calls and it comes 7-6-5. On 7-6-5, this is a spot where when the opponent checks, you should do a whole lot of checking, especially with hands that, like are just not going to win all that often. It may feel a little bit dirty to check behind with something like king, queen, or king, jack. But on 7-6-5, it's just so easy for your opponent to have something to the point that you don't want to put a whole lot of money in this pot. There, you don't have a 55% equity advantage or more. It's closer to 50-50. So it's closer to 50-50 because your opponent has a whole lot of sets, straights, 2 pairs, 1 pairs, and you have a whole lot of unpaired hands. You're forced to do way more checking, which implies when you have hands that just aren't that good, you check them on the flop. Now, to be clear, when you check them on the flop, it does not mean you are checking and then never, ever, ever putting money in at any point. If you do, check behind with something like Jack 10 on the 7-6-5, and your opponent checks on a random turn like a queen, you should probably start bluffing. But on the flop, you should probably be checking these hands, because if you bet and get raised, you got to fold, and sometimes you turn top pair, sometimes you get a bluffing opportunity. And you have to make sure you're just far more cautious in these spots where you are not favored, which makes logical sense, right? If you are favored, you want to put money in the pot. And if you are not favored, you don't want to put money in the pot. Also, you want to consider who has the nut advantage, which is a little bit different than the range advantage. The range advantage is how your entire range does against your opponent's entire range. The nut advantage is essentially who has more really, really, really strong hands in their range, like three of a kinds or straights or flushes or whatnot. When you have a lot of nut hands in your range, you usually bet far more often. And also, you usually bet using a larger size. When you don't have that many nut hands, though, you should check more often. And when you do bet, usually you should bet using a smaller size. By the way, it is possible to have both the range advantage, but not the nut advantage. In those spots, you usually bet using a small size, sometimes frequently, sometimes not so much. For example, say you raise under the gun and the big blind calls, and the flop comes king, king, 3, and the big blind checks. This is a spot where on king, king, 3, you have a lot of trip kings in your range. So this is a great spot to bet, often using a medium or large size. If instead the flop comes something like 7, 6, 6, well, now you don't have very many sixes in your range at all, right? But the big blind does. They're going to defend the big blind with 7, 6, 8, 6, 9, 6, a bunch of suited sixes, right? So when they check, if you do bet, you're usually going to bet using a small size, and you should probably not bet every single time in that spot. Next, your position is very relevant. When you're in position, you should bet somewhat frequently. When you're out of position, you should check far more often, to the point that when you raise and someone calls and you are out of position, so say you raise from the cutoff and the button calls, very rarely should you bet every single time, which means with a lot of your hands that are just not very good, you're usually going to want to check. Now, if your opponent does not raise often enough or call often enough, meaning they're just too straightforward, too passive, too cautious, too tight, it's probably okay to bet decently often using a small size with a wide range of junk, especially if it has any potential to improve, such as 2 overcards or a backdoor flush draw or something like that. It's okay if they will not play well. But if your opponent does play well, you will find that you simply have to check a ton from out of position. You can see this illustrated very clearly at peakgto.com. That's our new Game Theory Optimal library and trainer. Get in there, work hard, train yourself in these out of position spots, because a lot of people mess them up. Next, your stack depth is very important as well. As you get shorter and shorter, it becomes more costly to lose even a small continuation bet. Also, when you're shallow stacked, your junky draws are usually not getting all that good of implied odds to improve to a good hand. So, from out of position, not from out of position, well, definitely from out of position, but when you are shallower, you have to be more inclined to check and fold, especially if you think your continuation bet is likely to fail, usually because you don't have the range and nut advantage. So, as stacks get shallower, typically you should be continuation betting less often in general, which means when you just completely miss the flop, you're often going to be checking it. Your opponent's tendencies are incredibly important. Many decisions and the deviations you should make against your opponent will depend on what you've seen them do in the past, or what players in your games in general do incorrectly. That said, if you know your opponent is a calling station or just a generally crazy player, you probably don't want to bluff nearly as often, because those bluffs are going to be way less likely to succeed. If your opponent's going to call with any queen high or better, well, you probably don't want to be bluffing, right? That said, if your opponent is using an opposite strategy where they fold way too often, if you bet the flop and the turn and the river and they'll fold out everything worse than top pair, top kicker, and on top of that, you'd know they'd raise 2 pair and better on the flop or the turn, well, you just win this pot every time, right? Because very rarely are they going to have exactly top pair, top kicker, or a rivered, very strong hand. So, against players who are weak, tight, and straightforward, to the point that they will start folding out decently big hands that should clearly call on the river, against those players, you're going to want to bet far more often, even in the beginning of the pot, with your garbage. If Your opponent's going to fold too often, bluff far more often. If they're not going to fold that often, bluff far less often. Finally, before we get to some examples, the number of opponents in the pot is very important. As you're against more players, you want to bluff less often. And that's because someone is likely to flop a decent hand roughly 30-ish% of the time, sometimes more on some boards and less on other boards. But if you're against only one person and they're only going to have something decent 30% of the time, you're going to steal this pot a lot with a bet, right? But if you're against 4 players who each are going to have a good hand roughly 30-ish% of the time, odds are someone has something. You don't know which one it is, but it doesn't really matter which one it is because someone's going to have something. And if it's not you, it's probably one of them. So for that reason, against many players, you're usually going to only want to bet on the flop with your best made hands that are happy to get money in the pot and your strong draws that have a good potential to improve to beat even decently strong hands that your opponents have. That said, even then, it can be perfectly fine to check with your entire range, especially from out of position. For example, say you raise from first position and 4 people call, and the flop comes 10-9-6. This is a spot where even if you have a hand like pocket aces, you're probably going to want to check because on 10-9-6, it's really easy for someone to have a very strong hand. I actually played a hand very much like this a long time ago in a $25,000 buy-in tournament at Bellagio. I raised pocket aces under the gun. 4 or 5 players called. It came literally 10-9-6. The blinds checked. A lot of players in the spot continuation bet with their pocket aces because they want to get money in the pot against the medium strength hands and they don't want to get outdrawn. But even a long time ago, I knew check a lot from out of position on boards that are not good for your range. 10-9-6 is not great for the under the guns range, and on top of that, it's really good for the callers ranges. So I checked. Someone bet, someone called, someone raised, someone re-raised. Aces fold, lose my 3 big blinds, move on. Turns out it was set against set, and well, I lost 3 big blinds with my pocket aces. Whereas a lot of players instead would have bet the flop, got called, got raised, maybe got re-raised, and the worst players would take their aces and just load their 150 big blinds into the pot thinking, oh, aces are the nuts. I could be against a lot of draws. But no. Check fold. Goodbye. If you're enjoying today's video, before we move forward to some examples, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button down below. Click the notification bell. If you have a friend who doesn't know how to play when they miss, share this video with them. Let's get to some examples. Say you raise from under the gun and the big blind calls. The flop comes ace, king, queen, and they check. What should you do? Well, we discussed this already. This is a spot where you should be betting medium with your entire range because it will have connected amazingly well on this flop. Ace, king, queen is great for you. You pretty much have one of the best flops possible. Your opponent's range and the big blind is going to completely miss this flop a large chunk of the time. So bet, just get money in the pot. Here we're using a medium size instead of a small size because we also have the nut advantage. Not just the range advantage, but the nut advantage because we have all combinations of aces, kings, queens, jack 10 suited, ace, king, ace, queen, king, queen. All these hands are really good. So bet and get money in the pot. Example number 2. We raise from under the gun and the big blind calls and it comes 9-8-6. What do we do now? Well, this is a spot where we should usually only bet with our best made hands and draws because we will frequently get called or raised. So we want to make sure when we do get called or raised, we have a pretty good hand, right? This is also a spot where typically you are going to want to bet on the smaller side. As a general tip, if you do not have the nut advantage, when you bet, you usually want to bet small. Also, as another general tip, if there is a straight or flush available on the flop, especially if your opponent could have it, you usually want to bet small when you do decide to bet. Notice here, 10-7 and 7-5 both make a straight. The big blind could have those, especially the suited versions. So this is a spot where we want to be betting small if we do decide to bet. If instead the flop was 9-8-4, at this point there would be no straight and no flush available, right? So then you're going to want to bet using a larger size. okay? When there is a draw available, but no very premium made hand already, like a straight or flush, like on 9-8-4, you usually want to bet using a bigger size. When there's already a straight available that your opponent could have, you're going to want to bet using a smaller size. So on this flop, because it's not good for us, we're going to want to be betting really with just our best made hands and draws. When we have nothing, we're just going to get out of the way. So if we did have ace-2 suited, king-queen, pocket fours, all of these have to just check it back with the intention of folding if your opponent bets on the turn. They're just no good. They're junk. It's okay. Get out of the way. You do not crush by putting money in the pot at a huge disadvantage. Take a look at another example. You raise from under the gun and the button calls. So now we're out of position. It comes king, queen, 9. What should we do? Take a second. Think about it. Why don't you all take a second and really think about this one? Write what you would do in the comment section down below with your hands like ace-2 suited in this spot. This is a tricky one. While you're down there, click the like and subscribe button for me. Click the notification bell. Click all the buttons. I appreciate it. Don't click the thumb down button. Well, this is a tricky one. In this spot, you should only bet with your best made hands and draws because you will frequently get raised or called. But you may say, king, queen, 9 is pretty good for the under the gun player, right? Well, it is, but you got a problem. It's that this is also a really good flop for your opponent's range. They're going to have king, queen, king, jack, king 10, queen, jack, queen 10, queen 9 suited, jack 10 suited, maybe even offsuit, maybe pocket 9s, maybe even pocket queens if they're a little bit too tight. So this is a spot where your opponent has a lot of very good hands in their range. Recognize that when you raise and then someone calls, that's not enough information. The button's range is going to be a very different preflop calling range than the big blind caller. The big blind caller is closing the action, getting really good odds, so they can call far wider. The button, however, has to worry about the blinds calling or re-raising, which forces them to have a pretty good hand. Also, you're going to be out of position now. So we already learned earlier, when you're out of position, you have to check far more often. So here, if you just have total garbage, check and fold. If you want to compare pre-flop ranges, like how the big blind should call versus how the button should call, make sure you check out peakgto.com. All of that is available for you. Example number 4. You raise under the gun and the button calls and it comes king, 8, 2. What should we do? Well, now, we should be betting frequently using a small size with a lot of our range, except junk that has very little chance to improve, like jack 10 of hearts. You don't get to bet 100% of the time, but this is a spot where we have a lot of king X in our range, even though our opponent does, but they're also going to have a whole lot of garbage, like jack 10, queen jack, stuff like that. So this is a spot where it's usually okay to bet frequently using a small size, and exploitatively, this is a spot where I'd be way more inclined to bet frequently using a small size, maybe with everything, because a lot of players, if they have ace high and worse in this spot, they're just going to fold. And they're going to give you the pot far too easily. That's different than the previous scenario of queen jack 9, because this board is just so good for the button caller that they're going to have something a lot of the time. But on king 8-2, they're just going to have nothing a lot, or nothing. Nothing in a lot of people's minds a lot, and they'll fold a little bit too often to a small bet. Example number 5, you raise the cutoff, and the button and big blind call. The button and big blind both call. Flop comes jack, 10, 7. What should we do? It's a cool spot. Notice we do have 9-8 suited in our range. Pocket jacks, pocket 10s, pocket 7s, jack 10 suited, maybe even offsuit. We have a lot of good hands here. Despite that, we should be betting with our best made hands and draws. Annoying, I know. This is a spot where, though, the button and the big blind are going to connect really, really well with this flop, and it is now multi-way. So when you have nothing, like pocket 6s or ace 4, check and fold. It's okay. It's frustrating. It's annoying. It's okay to give up the pot. When you have nothing in a multi-way pot, you should pretty much always check and fold. How about instead, you raise from the low jack and the cutting and the button and the big blind call? What do we do? Well, same story. This is a spot where, again, it is far too easy for your opponents to have something, so you should be checking a lot. Notice you're out of position as well against the cutoff and the button. So say you do check here, and someone bets and someone calls, and you have a hand like ace 10, middle pair top kicker, a pretty great hand, right? Despite that, you should just fold, because when someone bets on Jack 10-7, they could already have you in very bad shape with just a jack or a straight or two pair or whatever. And when they don't have you in bad shape, they're usually going to have a hand like a flush draw or a straight draw. And those hands have a decent amount of equity in the pot. Also, say someone does bet the flop with king queen. Someone calls and then you call with the ace 10. The turn comes anything. You check. Somebody bets. You don't love it. So here, even though the ace 10 could be the best hand, your equity realization is going to be very, very low. You're only really going to be happy putting money in the pot on the turn and river when you improve to 3 10s or 2 pair with ace 10. And even then on ace 10, you could be crushed by king queen or ace jack or the straights that are already there. So this is a spot that is very, very bad for you. Multi-way, when there's a bet and a call on the flop, you got to be really cautious. Now, I do know in some small stakes games, players will call on the Jack 10-7 flop with 7-6 or 8-6, just trying to get a gut shot. If your opponent's going to be loosey-goosey having a sandwich, then sure, you get to stick around a little bit wider. But if your opponents are anywhere near competent at all at poker, and you have ace 10, check the flop. If there's a bet and a call, we're done. Now, if there's just a bet and everybody else folds, you probably have to stick around because then you're only against one player. It means your outs are going to be a little bit more live, and if they just check it down, you can win sometimes. But against a bet and a call, or a bet and a raise, you have to get out of the way quickly with your medium strength hands, post-flop, multi-way. So that's it. This is how you crush when you miss the flop. It is not always try to bulldoze your way through, and it's also not just check and fold and get out of the way. It does depend on a lot of factors like your range, your opponent's range, how they interact, your position, the stack depth, your opponent's tendencies, the number of players in the pot. I know it's a lot, but if you put all of this together and consistently think about these things, that's going to go a long way to helping you figure out when you should bet the flop when you miss and when you should simply check. And to further study this and really see it illustrated clearly, be sure to check out peakgto.com.